Welcome to another edition of Stories of the Dark. I am Glen Clark, and on your Monday evening. And tonight we're going to be talking about a subject that I've been wanting to do for quite a while, since I'd even thought about starting this program. We're going to be talking about the Amityville murders. And I know everybody's seen all the different movies that have been out. I think they've made way too many of them, to be honest with you, but still, they're good to watch, you know. But yeah, tonight we're going to be exploring that. I've got a website I'm going to read from, and I got a few YouTube videos. One particular video is from with Ed and Lorraine Warren, who investigated the house, and they're going to share their stories. I'll be playing that later on. And I'm proud to announce that I am now day 4 into not smoking. I decided once again to try to quit, and I'm doing the patch thing, so we'll see how that works out. And so far I'm feeling pretty good, other than a little bit of an itchy arm from the patch. It kind of has its little side effects, but other than that I'm doing pretty good. So, and as always, you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I also have SoundCloud, and I now have PodOMatic, and I also have a website. It's called buymeacoffee.com, so you're welcome to go take a look at those. Right now, I will go ahead and I'll read from... I got to bring up my internet here. I'm going to go ahead and read for you from allthat'sinteresting.com. It talks about the Amityville murders. The horrific true story of the Amityville movie murders behind the movie. Well, they did the movie, the murders in the movie. In November 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. slayed his entire family and inspired one of the greatest horror stories of all time, the Amityville murders. Shows a picture of the Amityville house, the way it was when the DeFeos lived there. And continuing on, just the mention of Amityville, New York, can send chills down your spine. After all, one of its iconic Dutch colonial houses made Time's top 10 list of haunted places, thanks to the notorious Amityville murders. This is almost entirely due to the 1977 book and later movie franchise, The Amityville Horror, though despite the book's claim that it recalls the true story of the hauntings within its walls, there's evidence that the residents of 112 Ocean Avenue, George and Kathy Lutz, fabricated the story that became an urban legend. What wasn't fabricated, however, were the unimaginable murders that occurred in the home before the Lutz's occupancy. In the early morning hours of November 13, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were slain in their beds with a .35 caliber rifle. 23-year-old Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr., the eldest child, confessed to murdering his entire family in cold blood. Dead were parents Louise and Ronald DeFeo Sr., and his siblings 18-year-old Dawn, 13-year-old Allison, 12-year-old Mark, and 9-year-old John Matthew. And it has a, looks like a little video you can check out there too. The gruesome Amityville murders were regarded as a catalyst for the spirits haunting 112 Ocean Avenue. However, some argue that the DeFeo family were also victims of the house. So did an evil presence already reside in the house before the Amityville murders and force a young man to kill his entire family? What we do know is that Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s childhood was monetarily very comfortable, but not content. His father was a domineering and abusive man, and his mother seemed to fade into the background under his overbearing personality. From that, Ronnie Jr. grew increasingly troubled into young adulthood. He began to rely on drugs and alcohol to cope. He lashed out physically and even threatened his father with a gun. DeFeo's parents hoped that a weekly stipend and gifts would appease their troublesome son. By age 18, Ronald technically held a job at the family-owned auto dealership, but rarely bothered to show up. So on that day in 1974, it wasn't unusual that DeFeo decided to leave work at noon out of boredom. He met with friends at a bar, constantly calling his house to no answer, and complaining about it to anyone who would listen. He eventually left. The next time anyone saw Ronnie, the entire town of Amityville would be changed forever. And it shows a picture of the rifle allegedly used by Ronald DeFeo. According to the book American Mass Murders by Valerie Plaza, DeFeo re-entered the bar at around 6:30 a.m. yelling, "You've got to help me. I think my mother and father are shot." Some patrons followed him back to the house on Ocean Avenue and became a witness to the horrifying scene within. All 6 bodies were found in their beds, positioned on their stomachs. The victims appeared to be shot with a high-powered rifle at around 3:15 a.m. However, there were some things that don't quite add up. There were no signs of any struggle present on the bodies or evidence that they were drugged. No neighbors who were awake reported hearing any gunshots, only the DeFeo's family dog barking into the night. Upon a police investigation, DeFeo's alibi of being at work and then at the bar began to crumble. As police noted, the family had been dead before 6 a.m. DeFeo frantically changed his story, as he would several more times throughout the Amityville murders investigation. At one point, he claimed that mob hitman Louis Fellini killed his family and made DeFeo watch. But, oops, my website decided to change on me. Okay, continuing on, but Fellini had a solid out-of-state alibi, and soon DeFeo confessed to police what was assumed to be the truth. He'd murdered his family by himself. And on the website it shows a picture of him in custody. DeFeo stood trial on October 14, 1975. His attorney, William Weber, mounted an insanity plea, stating that the defendant heard voices that told him to kill his family. However, the prosecution argued that while the drug-abused DeFeo was indeed troubled, he knew what he was doing when he committed the Amityville murders. A jury convicted him on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced him to 6 concurrent sentences of 25 years to life. In a later version of Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s changed story, he alleges that his sister Dawn killed their father, and then their distraught mother killed all the siblings. In this scenario, DeFeo only killed his mother. Then, in another telling by DeFeo in 1990, he has Dawn shooting all the DeFeos before he himself kills Dawn. There are yet other theories that place a second shooter in the house. Though the stories of the Amityville house being haunted are subject to debate, there is very little doubt that Ronald DeFeo Jr. was present for the mass murder of his family in the home. But the question still lingers, is the Amityville house really haunted? Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s attorney, William Weber, was more involved in the lore than you may expect. He claims that George and Kathy Lutz, the home's next occupants for only 28 days, approached him about an idea for a book and said, "We created this horror story over many bottles of wine. It is a hoax." And scrolling down here, you can see a picture of George and Kathy Lutz. Weber has since brought a lawsuit against the Lutzes for taking the story of the haunting to another publishing partner. He demanded a share of the profits of a cool $60 million. Eventually, they settled out of court for $2,500 plus $15,000 for his services connected with the book and subsequent movie. Whether you choose to believe the Amityville house is haunted or not, some interesting information is still out there. One of their sons, Daniel Lutz, claims he was possessed by a spirit much like Regan McNeil in The Exorcist. The other son, Christopher, vehemently insists that he did have run-ins with the paranormal, including the time he saw a presence as definite as a shadow in the shape of a man that moved toward him and then dissipated. Interestingly enough, both George and Kathy Lutz took a lie detector test about their story and passed. And that's the end of that one. That was again from allthat'sinteresting.com. And right now we're going to go ahead and take a little break and play some music, and we'll come right back. I'm Glen Clark, and this is Stories of the Dark. And welcome back to Stories of the Dark. I am your host, Glen Clark, and we are talking about the Amityville murders and the stories that surround that whole story there. If you'd like to comment or email me on this particular topic or any topic I've talked about, you can email me at storiesofthedark1@gmail.com. That's storiesofthedark1@gmail.com. And right now I'm going to play for you a video from YouTube. It comes from the Paranormal Scholar. You can, I believe I played a couple of their videos before. This is the real Amityville horror, unveiling the terror behind the fiction, I believe is what it said. It kind of hides some of it on my phone. But anyway, we'll play this and then I'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about this.
This is WOR New York. Stay tuned for In Conversation.
First, this bulletin from the WOR newsroom. 6 members of one family have been found shot to death in their night clothes in their expensive home in Amityville, Long Island. The only available information at this moment, according to the Amityville Village Police, is that the victims have been identified as members of the DeFeo family. They were found by a 23-year-old son, Ronald DeFeo, who is believed to be the only surviving member of the family. 6 members of the family found shot to death in their home in Amityville, Long Island. We will have further details on the 11 o'clock news.
This was the first radio broadcast to announce the murders which would in no time at all become infamous across the world. The Amityville murders committed by Ronald DeFeo Jr. The entire DeFeo family was shot in their sleep by son and brother Ronald. This atrocity would spark the beginning of a modern-day bloody legend. A legend which has been adopted and adapted in the grotesquely fantastical creations of 15 Amityville films. Ronald initially claimed that the murders were conducted by a mob hitman, whom he named. However, this story was soon proved inconsistent, since the supposed hitman was out of the state of New York at the time of the murders. Within a day, Ronald confessed to having committed the mass murder himself. He said, "It all started so fast. Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." That which he referred to as it began around 3 in the morning at 112 Ocean Avenue. Ronald took his .35 caliber rifle and meticulously shot his 2 brothers, 2 sisters, mother and father. A bullet each for his siblings, double for his parents. Afterwards, Ronald drew a bath and redressed, disposed of his gun in the family swimming pool, then went to work as usual. It wasn't until later that day, around 6:30 in the evening, that Ronald announced the discovery of his slain family at the local bar. Ronald's story has altered many times since the cold-blooded happenings of that morning. The most well-known version of events was claims that he had killed his family due to demonic voices in his head. During his trial, Ronald's lawyer mounted a defense of insanity, which was supported by a court psychiatrist. Regardless, the final judgment found Ronald both guilty and aware of his actions, resulting in him being sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. In the years that have followed, Ronald has claimed that he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol when he performed the murders. In another version of the story, it was his sister, Dawn, who was the murderer, Ronald only killing her in the struggle which broke out upon the discovery of his dead family. His story has changed so many times that the only truth which we can now be certain of is that Ronald DeFeo Jr. is a notorious liar. Indeed, perhaps the most demonic aspect of the Amityville murders is the imagination of the murderer himself. However, regardless of Ronald's testimonies, there are certain facts which make the case particularly strange. All of the victims were found lying on their stomachs, with no signs of struggle. toxicology reports have proved that no sedatives were used, and the police found no evidence of Ronald having used a silencer on his very loud lever-action rifle. How then did the DeFeo family remain asleep in their beds as Ronald killed them one by one? In the court transcripts, Dr. Howard Alderman, the medical examiner on the case, reveals that he was mystified as to how a single gunman could have committed the crime. In response, there have been several competitive theories, from the very earthly to the paranormal. However, none truly satisfies the question of how Ronald cocked and loaded and shot again and again and again, murdering his entire family whilst they stayed sound asleep. A little over a year later, 112 Ocean Avenue, the scene of such ghastly murders, became home to a new family. The house, with all of its furnishings still in place, was bought by George and Kathy Lutz and their 3 children. Whilst aware of the events that had taken place there, the Lutzes were optimistic, describing the house as their dream home. They even erected a sign which named the house High Hopes. However, they would only inhabit the house for 28 days. They would end up being forced from its walls, running out in their nightwear, abandoning all of their possessions, never to return. The events that allegedly occurred during those 28 days have since become legendary. Many have claimed that the Lutzes fabricated the fantastical tale to make money. However, to stake all of one's possessions, reputation, and livelihoods on the unlikelihood that someone will find your story interesting enough to write a successful book and produce a successful movie seems too ludicrous a gamble for even the most ambitious of risk-takers. In addition, multiple sources have suggested that the Lutzes would have enjoyed only marginal profits from the Amityville horror franchise. In a 2002 interview, George Lutz named this figure as close to $300,000 after taxes and legal fees. By way of contrast, the 1979 Amityville horror film alone is reported to have grossed over $86 million in theaters. Skeptics have also argued that the Lutzes got into financial difficulties and needed a sensational story to rid themselves of the house. However, after just 28 days, it is unlikely that the Lutzes had the time to reach such a dismal point. Indeed, by the time that they fled, they had not even made their first mortgage payment. The Lutzes had no reasonable motive to concoct this tale. It was only in their eventual endeavor to exorcise their home that reporters were able to gain access to the Amityville house and make its story famous. Therein lies the true horror of Amityville. When you listen to any of the Lutzes' testimonies, there is an inescapable sense that they believe what they are saying is the truth. It was on the very first day of moving into the house that the Lutzes began to feel as though something was not quite right. A family friend and local Catholic priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro, visited the house to perform a blessing. This was nothing unusual for a family of faith moving into a new home. George described what happened during one of his final interviews before his death in 2006. Whilst performing the blessing, the priest was left disturbed by a strange feeling that he got in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Pecoraro described the room to George, who told him that it would be a sewing room. The priest supposedly looked relieved, then said, "That's good, as long as no one sleeps in there." Paranormal events began to unfold immediately.
Within a week, Kathy's hand had been touched by something that we discussed and couldn't explain. It was just something unseen.
We also had hordes of flies that would appear within 2 rooms, and no matter how many times we would kill them, they would reappear.
It wasn't in the water. The china itself turned black, and at first it was one bathroom, and then another, and then another.
And then telephone repairman came 3 times because each time we would try and communicate with the priest, we would run into faulty connections.
Repeatedly, noises would jolt the family from their sleep in the night. It was George in particular who reported the most disturbance. He described how he would hear the front door violently open and close, only to then investigate and see it locked, with the dog asleep in front of it.
I heard what I could only describe as a marching band tuning up. and at one time it had sounded like they had rolled up the carpet. There were so many footsteps down there. There was so much noise. And he'd go running downstairs, see what it is, what caused this. And he'd get to the landing halfway, and there's nothing. And the dog would be asleep.
Paranormal investigator Ed Warren drew attention to how a lot of the activity would happen at around 3 o'clock in the morning, the same time that Ronald DeFeo murdered his family. Kathy Lutz reported that she was lulled into a state of deep, contented lethargy by the house. She would never want to leave. Even the simplest of chores was too much for her. Others have even stressed how the house seemed to age Kathy, both mentally and physically. On the night that the family fled the house, George claims to have witnessed his wife transform into an elderly woman before his very eyes, a visage which took several hours to wear off.
By the time we left, we had lost a considerable amount of weight. Kathy was passing out quite regularly. I had lost over 26 pounds.
Arguably, it is all too easy to dismiss the Lutz's story as make-believe. The level of detail in their testimonies makes their claims captivating, especially when one considers the consistency with which they maintain their story throughout their lives. A more recent documentary, filmed in 2012, after the deaths of both Kathy and George, has added further evidence and intrigue to the Amityville case. For the first time since the events of 1976, one of the Lutz children, Daniel Lutz, has come forward to discuss his childhood experiences. Daniel has corroborated his mother and stepfather's testimonies, whilst adding to them with his own experiences. One of the most traumatic events, which has haunted him since the day it occurred, was when he witnessed the door of the boathouse open and slam shut repeatedly and with great violence. The family dog, Harry, was profoundly disturbed, his pen being beside the boathouse. In an attempt to escape, he jumped over the fence of his pen, suspended above the ground by his lead, seemingly trying to hang himself. After rescuing the dog, it took Daniel and George great effort to close the door. It was at this point Daniel recalls one of the most bizarre aspects of his experiences at Amityville. During the interview, his own disbelief at what he saw, even many years later, is plain to see. Just by watching, you can see that Daniel knows what he is about to say sounds ridiculous. However, he says it all the same.
What did you see? What was in the window?
It would have been what looked like a cartoon character of an angry pig with like wolf-like teeth.
When he and George went upstairs to investigate, they found a rocking chair moving back and forth by itself. Daniel has claimed that he was possessed by a powerful entity in the house. The following extract is taken from an interview and is in his own words.
I just got in a fight with George about, I don't even remember anymore. So by the time I got to the second landing, I was projected up the stairs into the walls. And my mother was like 15 feet behind me. I know that the spirit of some other thing passed right through me. My mother was standing right there, and she just broke down and cried. That was the most horrible thing she had ever seen. And I stand up and my body starts like I no longer have control of myself. She jumps around in shock, like something just scraped her or touched her. And it entered me, through me. And if I have to describe what it felt like, it would be like the numbness after being shot. From somewhere in the room it said, "It is you." It was like sub-bass, like a gargle and a crackle to it. That stuck with me for at least a decade on a daily basis.
Even after leaving the Amityville house, Daniel was sent to a Catholic monastic school by his parents. There, the priests performed ritual exorcisms for a year to rid him of the demon which had possessed him in the house. On the last night the Lutzes spent at Amityville, the two boys and Kathy were lifted up on their beds by some unseen force. Daniel has described how he was terrified as the headboard of his and his brother's beds smashed against each other and the ceiling. They were trapped on the beds as they levitated. This was the final straw for the family. They could take no more. After 28 days living in a perpetual state of terror, the Lutzes called Father Pecoraro, who advised that they leave the house and spend the night elsewhere. In their night clothes, they left. Whilst away from the Amityville house, the realization that they needed help to cleanse the house dawned on George and Kathy. So, it was in the March of 1976 that psychics, paranormal researchers, and a Channel 5 news crew were allowed access to 112 Ocean Avenue. Amongst the investigators were Ed and Lorraine Warren. During the initial investigation, Lorraine was repulsed by one of the rooms, later discovered to have been the bedroom of Ronald DeFeo. Lorraine believed that while several spirits roamed the house, there was one particular entity which was both of greater power and greater malevolence than the others.
When we went into the house that day, we didn't realize that it was diabolically infested. This case had everything. It had the monstrosities of the night which roamed that house, which infested it, which caused a young man to murder his whole family.
The Amityville case affected our personal lives more than any case we ever worked on.
It was the Warrens' photographer who captured the infamous image of a spectral child in a doorway. Some have speculated that this is the ghostly presence of the youngest member of the family to be murdered in 1974, John Matthew DeFeo. However, lots of criticism surround the paranormal investigations that took place in the aftermath of the Lutzes' 28 Days of Hell. Certainly, it is worth mentioning that the Channel 5 news crew did not pick up anything strange on film. Since the Lutzes, there have been no reports of any further paranormal activity at the Amityville house. The lack of subsequent hauntings, combined with the heavy reliance on eyewitness testimony, has given much credence to the belief that the Amityville horror was an elaborate hoax. However, Daniel Lutz, now an adult, tells another tale, one that he was denied a chance to tell when the event occurred. He states that all the hauntings happened and were triggered by George Lutz. Despite denials during his lifetime, Daniel asserts that George was a man who enjoyed to dabble in the occult.
I think somewhere along the line that George's beliefs and practices and things that he was directly involved with triggered and was a catalyst to what was going on in the house, and it was kind of like a magic trick gone bad that you couldn't shut off.
Daniel also states that George was an abusive stepfather and the catalyst that led him to leave home at the age of 15. It is interesting that Daniel would corroborate the story of a man who both personally repulsed him and abused him as a child. Could this, then, be the explanation? Certainly, that the haunting seemed to stop after the Lutzes left Amityville can be explained by George's personal connection to the activity. What is more, one has to wonder why he would keep all of the material possessions of those who had died in the house before him. Could it be that, as a dabbler in the occult, George knew something of the alleged power of death and blood? Perhaps George Lutz had attempted to tap into this energy. However, rather than harness the residue that had been left behind by the murdered souls of the DeFeos, George disturbed something darker. He unleashed demonic forces which he could not control upon himself and his family. Such an explanation is a concurrent theme in poltergeist activity. There is always someone involved in occult practices who acts as a trigger. In the case of the Enfield poltergeist, it was young Janet Hodgson who played with Ouija boards. Could something similar have happened at Amityville? Furthermore, if this was the case, was this malevolent entity a new energy? Or had it been there all along, and part of the explanation behind the mystifying nighttime mass murder of the sleeping DeFeos? Unfortunately, all we can do is question. With the death of George Lutz, we shall never know the secret behind his alleged covert interest in the occult. And so, with the lack of any physical evidence and the overdependence on testimony, it is probable that we will never know for certain the truth behind the Amityville horror. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and remember to subscribe for more of the paranormal.
When it comes to poltergeist activity, there's none more famous than the case of the Enfield poltergeist. Between the years 1977
And that was the Paranormal Scholar with the real Amityville horror story there. Interesting video. If you have any comments on that, please comment on there and on my page below where you see all in the description. I mean, with that particular case, I don't know really what to believe. I mean, we've all heard the stories that it was a hoax. It was real. So I mean, I take I guess a more neutral stance on it. I mean, I want to believe it. I'd love to investigate that house. That's always been a dream of mine to do that. So. If any of you also, if you have any stories that you might like to add, if some are actually in that area, drop me a line at storiesofthedark1@gmail.com. That's storiesofthedark1@gmail.com. And we're going to take a little break right now and play a little music and come back, and I'll have another YouTube video for you. I'm Glen Clark, and this is Stories of the Dark. And welcome back to Stories of the Dark. I am Glen Clark, and we're talking about the Amityville murders and the stories that surround that. Just a little bit of a pitch here. For Halloween, I would like to do a good long show, maybe even a live program. So what I'm looking for is some of your best and real ghost stories. So if you have any of those, and even pictures, whatever EVPs, we're kind of looking for it all for this show. So go ahead and send those to me also at storiesofthedark1@gmail.com, and I'll read through those and select a bunch of them, and I'll read those on Halloween night, and also maybe even be set up by then to take some calls and maybe have some of you involved in the program as well. That would be quite a fun show. So right now what I'd like to play for you is comes from YouTuber Ali Mazuren. It's part one of an interview he did that was with Ed and Lorraine Warren, and they're going to talk about the Amityville case as well. The sound may be a little bit low, so you might want to turn up your speakers for this one. So as soon as this one is done, we'll come back and take a break. Then I'll air part two of that interview. So here we go.
Long-legged beasties and things that go bump in the night. Good Lord, deliver us. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Seekers of the Supernatural. I'm your moderator, Tony Spera, with hosts Ed and Lorraine Warren. Tonight's program will be an exciting one, and it will include ghosties and beasties and things that go bump in the night. Tonight we're going to be speaking about one of the most horrific cases that the Warrens have ever investigated, the Amityville Horror. Now, Ed, can you tell me how you and Lorraine got involved in the Amityville Horror?
Well, it was Marvin Scott from Channel 5 news team. He was the anchorman at the time, and he had been involved with a haunting that we had investigated in Bloomfield, New Jersey, and he was impressed by this. So he gave us a ring and he said, we'd like you to come down and see what's going on in Amityville, Long Island. Now, this was not the Amityville horror case at that time, you understand. Mm-hmm. This was just another haunted house, and we didn't even realize that 6 people had been murdered in that house of the Fayol family. So we said, sure, we'd come down there, and we did. And that was the beginning of an adventure which we'll never forget, a supernatural adventure. Mm-hmm. When we went into the house that day, we didn't realize that it was diabolically infested. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I would have to say that Amityville was a 10. I want to make it clear at the beginning of this program that Lorraine and I do not back up the movie or the book. Mm-hmm. It was much more horrific than either. You didn't have to take a literary license in a book or dramatic license in a movie. This case had everything. It had the monstrosities of the night which roamed that house, which infested it, which caused a young man to murder his whole family. Ronald DeFeo is now serving 6 consecutive life sentences at Dannemora Prison. But you know, Amityville horror goes way back before the Lutz family, who moved in there and bought the house later, and were fled 28 days later. It goes back 6 months before the DeFeos were murdered. Mr. DeFeo went up to Montreal, Canada. He went to a shrine where many miracles had occurred. A lot of people don't know this. He went to that shrine and he brought back from there a priest, an exorcist, who said masses in the house. Why? If this was a hoax that was created by the Lutz family, why 6 months before this man was murdered and his family was an exorcist in that house? While the priest was saying a mass and performed the exorcism rituals, candles were blowing out, doors were opening and closing. There were footsteps all around the house. Ronald DeFeo, who was the murderer of his family, fled the house. He didn't stay there. He did not want to stay there while the priest was in that house. What caused him to leave? Obsession? Possession? Who can say? We do know that this young man did murder every member of his family in that house, shot them to death. On November 13th, 1974, at 3:15 in the morning. He had a high-powered rifle. Now, when you see the photographs later, and these are the only pictures ever taken inside the Amityville horror house, because Lorraine and I and just a handful of other investigators actually went in there. I've heard people on TV say, I was in that house, I investigated. They never were. If they don't have any evidence, they have no proof. We have the proof, and you'll see that proof tonight. They will see the only photographs ever taken in the house itself at the time of the investigation, and as the Lutzes left that home, completely furnished. They didn't take one thing with them. They left everything there, and they went off to California. Because Father Pecoraro, who many people said did not exist, talked with Lorraine and I. He told us all the horrible things that happened to him. We sat with him. He was as close as I am to you, Tony, at dinner at Kathy Lutz's mother's home in Deer Park. He told me things that the public has never heard about. And tonight, we are going to endeavor to explain what really happened in that home.
Okay, Lorraine, I know you went in the house and you experienced things, but can we just go over how you first were called into the house? Like, who was the gentleman or people that called you in? Was it the Lutzes that called you in?
No, it was not, Tony. It was Marvin Scott who called us in. He told us there had been a tragedy in that home. He didn't go into detail regarding it. He told us that it was a prominent family. He also told us during that very first conversation that the family that were living there at the present time had fled and left all of their possessions behind. And their viewers were very interested of the history of that house and what exactly might be wrong with the home. That's how we first became involved. Now, I had to tell Marvin Scott at that time that there was no way that we could go in that home without an invitation and permission from the family, which came very readily. But realize, when we met with George Lutz, not Kathy, because Kathy and the children were not there. When we met with George, he wouldn't go anywhere near the house. He met us at a pizza parlor and sat with us and talked because he was so frightened.
Well, I understand that George wasn't really he was a no-nonsense kind of a guy,
He was
right?
really a no-nonsense man.
George Lutz was an ex-Marine. He was a karate expert. He ran around with motorcycle gangs. We're not talking about any altar boy here. We're talking about a rough, tough guy who, after 28 days in that house, fled, left everything behind, took his wife and children, and went off to California.
See, he was the type of person that felt like he had to always be in control. He would go out on the landings. It was 3 stories high. The home is very beautiful. The interior of the home is very formal and it's very beautiful. And he would go out and he would take his fist and he would tell what was there, or command what was there to come out so he could fight it. Because as far as he was concerned, he was very skeptical regarding the fact that anything paranormal was going on. At the time that this first began, he found it difficult because of his background to even believe in a God, never mind believe that something of this nature was taking place. But I have to say this, the Amityville case affected our personal lives more than any case we ever worked on.
Really?
It was, yes.
How? What way?
Well, it was to find.
My name is Tony Spera. I'll be your moderator tonight, along with Ed and Lorraine Warren. Last show we spoke of the Amityville Horror in our Part 1 series. We delved more or less, Ed, into the history of Amityville, to the background of the house. But tonight I think what we'd like to do is speak more of the phenomena that actually occurred in the home. So can we begin, Ed, with some of the phenomena that did actually occur at 112 Ocean Avenue?
Okay, in the beginning, George and Kathy would feel the psychic cold throughout all the rooms. No matter how many logs they'd throw on a fire, it was icy cold. That's because it's a psychic cold, and the cold is being drawn. The heat from the bodies of the people in that house is being drawn, and that heat is going to be used as an energy fuel source for the spirits in that house. So they'd feel the psychic cold. They'd hear magic whispering, voices throughout the hallways. At night, they would see ghost lights over their beds in the rooms. There was a time when George and Kathy found themselves about 2 foot from the ceiling. George looked over at Kathy and said, "Do you believe this? Do you believe it?" And of course, then they went to lower themselves down into the bed again. But there would be the footsteps. There would be the slime that they would find on the staircase. Now, these are called apports. These materialize or dematerialize in such haunted houses. For instance, in many homes that we go into, we will find that you might see blood, as they did, coming down the wall. But if you went over there and touched that wall, there'd be no blood. This is a telepathic projection to the viewer, and it bypasses the physical eye, goes into the mind's eye, and they see it as a medium would see it. There was the marching band, as they described it, around 3:15 in the morning when the murders had taken place. A lot of things would happen at around 3 o'clock. We call this the devil's hour because it's an insult to the Trinity, anything that comes in threes. They would hear this marching band. George would jump out of bed. He'd go running down the stairs. As soon as he'd get down to the foyer, the music would stop. But he'd look into the living room, that huge living room, which you'll see a picture of, and the rugs were actually rolled up and the furniture was pushed over to the sides of the walls as though somebody were actually marching there. There were so much different types of phenomena that occurred to us and the people that went in there. It was incredible. I told you about the experience last week of where I felt as I was being smothered. Going into that home again, Lorraine felt many things. She, as a clairvoyant, would be more sensitive. Mary Pasquarella, who was the director of the Psychic Research Institute in Hamden, Connecticut, never went into a haunted house after that. She gave up the work because she was so badly affected by it. The cameraman that went in there with Channel 5 news team had heart palpitations. These guys, they were in battles in World War II. Of course, it bothered them, but never as much as going into that house there.
Well, it was the physical effects on their body, Tony, that was bothering them. And then one of the scientists that had come up from Duke University, he became so terrified in this home, and the chair that he was sitting on actually went right backwards with him in it. They had a real hard time just stabilizing him emotionally in that home. But it seemed like, and it's true to the fact that people are affected on their weakest, most vulnerable levels. And I think many times people of science go into a home like this not really expecting to be affected personally, just to be there and be witness to it. But they have nothing to fall back on. They have no faith, Tony. They can't call on any inner strength other than their own personal knowledge. And in a way, that, as far as I'm concerned, they can't possibly be too objective that way.
You know, Father Pecoraro told me about an experience he had when he left the house. He went back to his rectory. He was up in his room. Suddenly the room became icy cold. Ghost lights were shooting all over the place, and a deep, harsh, growling voice occurred in that room. He seen what he described as a lizard-like creature. Now, as a demonologist, I have seen diabolical. In fact, at one time, I had seen 43 of them. I knew exactly what he was talking about. It's something that you can't describe to anybody. It's something that's from another world. And as he described that, you could see the terror in this man's face. He wasn't used to these types of things. And the same thing happened to him again in a hotel room in Florida with a rabbi. The both of them experienced this. And when this lizard-like creature appeared in that room to these two men, and it finally faded, the glass in the windows turned red.
Now, speaking of the clergy, Lorraine, you had mentioned before, and I think we're going to see a slide of him, you have mentioned Padre Pio from Italy, who I believe was a Franciscan
Yes,
monk.
he was. He was a Franciscan monk.
I think we're going to have a shot of him coming up. Now, if we could get that slide.
Stigmata.
Yes, here it is right
Yes.
here. Can you explain, Ed, what we're looking at here? And Lorraine, either one of you.
He suffered the wounds of Christ, Tony, for 50 years of his life, which meant that he bled just as Christ bled on the cross.
So did he bleed from his feet also?
Yes, he did. Yes. But
now, the incredible thing was that 10 minutes after this man died, 10 minutes, all of these wounds disappeared.
They all were healed, Tony. Yes.
There were the critics who would say, well, the man did this to himself. After he was dead, he couldn't do anything to himself. And these wounds simply disappeared.
Okay, here's a close-up.
Okay, now,
Here's a close-up of Padre Pio.
Look at this close-up. Look at this profile.
If we could go back a little further and see the hood.
If we could.
And I'm Glen Clark, and this is Stories of the Dark, and you are listening there to Ed and Lorraine Warren give their testimonies on the Amityville horror story. Well, that brings this edition of Stories of the Dark to a close. I hope you enjoyed the show tonight. I know I certainly enjoyed doing this topic, and maybe we'll do it again sometime when we can get some more material. Like to, as always, thank all my followers on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You all are what makes the program what it is, and also to BlakCircleGirl and all the work she does and all the development stuff she's done with my YouTube, especially on my Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and now SoundCloud, PodOMatic, and BuyMeACoffee.com. Pretty soon I'll probably have about a 2 or 3 page list that I'll be reading from once we get going. So anyway, I'd like to thank all of you again for joining me, and until our next edition of Stories of the Dark, I just want to say everybody be safe out there, and if you do any paranormal investigating or anything of that nature, just make sure you get permission. Like I always say, don't do anything that's gonna get you in any trouble. So until our next edition, I'm Glen Clark, and this is Stories of the Dark. Have a great night, everyone.